Most hands at a cash game table are decided before the average player realizes a decision was even available. Imagine sitting at the table, the tension building as you weigh your options. These moments are defined by the interplay of position, stack depth, player tendencies, and board texture. Understanding the subtle factors that distinguish a marginal spot from a highly profitable one requires close attention to betting patterns and opponent profiles. It's about pinpointing those in-game spots where disciplined aggression or timely restraint can yield the greatest returns. Each hand offers at least one opportunity where a well-timed decision can shift the expected outcome in your favor. To capitalize on these, you must anticipate how opponents might react and recognize when the dynamics of the table begin to shift. This approach moves beyond generalized strategy, targeting the nuanced contexts where skilled players consistently extract value. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy the content, please consider liking and subscribing, and comments are always welcome. Chapter 1: The Blind Steal Opportunity. Some pots are easier to take than others. The players in the blinds are already at a disadvantage before a card is dealt. They've committed chips without seeing their hand. They'll act first on every post-flop street, and most of the time they'd rather not play a big pot out of position. That structural pressure is what makes late position raises so consistently profitable when you're targeting the right opponents. The first thing you need to do is watch. Before you start raising light from the button or the cutoff, you want to know how the players in the blinds are responding to late position opens. Some players fold their blinds constantly. Over many orbits, you'll notice they almost never defend. They fold pre-flop, post their blind the next time around, and fold again. That pattern is what you're looking for. It suggests their blind defense frequency is low, and that tends to make late position raises more profitable against them. In live full ring games, you can track this just by paying attention. If a player in the big blind has folded to the last 4 or 5 late position raises without pushing back once, that's meaningful information. It's not a guarantee they'll fold the next one, but it shifts the likelihood in your favor. Online, tracking software gives you a fold-to-steal percentage, and a high number there over a real sample tells you the same thing more precisely. Tight players in the blinds also tend to behave a certain way when they do continue. They don't flat call very often. When they do put chips in, it's usually a 3-bet with a narrow, strong range. That passivity is actually useful to you. It means most of the time you're getting a clean fold, and on the rare occasion they 3-bet, you can give them credit for a real hand and fold without much damage. Sizing matters more than most players give it credit for. In a deep stacked cash game with no limpers, a raise to around 2.5 to 3 big blinds is a standard steal size from late position. That range works in most spots. It's large enough to apply real pressure. It also doesn't overcommit chips when someone decides to play back. The size you choose should respond to what the table is doing. If the blinds are defending frequently, you can actually come down closer to 2 to 2.5 big blinds. You're risking less per attempt, and the fold equity is still there because the blinds are calling with a wide range anyway, not 3-betting you out of the pot. On the other hand, if you're facing a player who almost never defends, some players will size up slightly above their standard open. The logic is that the fold frequency is high enough to justify risking a few extra chips, and when the steal works, you capture a bigger pot. One thing worth keeping in mind is that using a consistent raise size across all your pre-flop opens is generally the stronger approach. If you raise to 2 big blinds when you're stealing, and 3 big blinds when you have a real hand, attentive players will notice the pattern. Keeping your sizing uniform reduces the information available to them. The smaller your steal size, the better the pot odds you're giving the blinds to call. That's the trade-off. A smaller size costs less per attempt, but invites more calls. A larger size earns more folds, but puts more chips at risk when someone continues. When opponents start adjusting to your steal frequency, the adjustments usually come in a few forms. They'll call more often. They'll 3-bet more often. And post-flop, they'll start applying pressure on boards that don't connect well with a wide late position range. Check raises become more common. Float and attack lines start appearing more often. The table as a whole may start calling you down lighter and 3-betting you with hands they'd normally fold. The response to that pressure isn't to stop stealing. It's to tighten your stealing range slightly and lean toward hands that hold reasonable equity when called, or 3-bet. You're not abandoning the strategy. You're adjusting the composition of it so the hands you're stealing with can still compete when the pot goes further than expected. The steal is profitable when you pick your spots. It gets less profitable when you do it indiscriminately against players who've already shown you they're not going to fold. Chapter 2: Exploiting the Calling Station. Most pressure at the table gets one of two responses. A player folds or they push back. What catches people off guard is the third response, the one that does neither. The pot just grows, and they stay in it. That's the calling station. And once you recognize one, your whole approach to that player shifts. The core trait is passivity combined with wide continuation. A calling station doesn't fold to bets, and they don't raise to apply pressure back. The core trait is passivity combined with wide continuation. A calling station doesn't fold to bets, and they don't raise to apply pressure back. They call. They do it pre-flop with hands that most players would release. They do it on the flop with weak pairs and draws. They do it on the turn when the board gets scarier. The hand strength doesn't drive the decision. The instinct to stay in does. Pre-flop, you'll notice them limping frequently. When someone raises, they call rather than fold or 3-bet. Their pre-flop raise frequency is low. That pattern tells you they're not building pots with strong hands. They're just trying to see flops cheaply and then figure it out from there. Post-flop, they check and call rather than lead or raise. If you're playing online and tracking stats, a high voluntarily put money in pot number combined with a low pre-flop raise number is a strong signal. When to showdown percentage matters too. A player going to showdown with high frequency and regularly showing weak hands is telling you exactly what they're doing. In live games, you get that same information just by watching showdowns. When someone calls 3 streets and flips over second pair with a weak kicker, take note. When it happens more than once, you've identified your player. Now here's where the opportunity opens up. Against a player who won't fold, fold equity disappears as a tool. That's not a problem. It's a clarification. You don't need them to fold. You need them to call. Value betting against a calling station means betting your strong hands for larger sizes than you might use against a disciplined player. Most opponents tighten their calling range when bet sizes increase. Calling stations don't do that. Their calling range stays wide regardless of whether you bet a third of the pot or the full pot. That tendency is what makes larger sizing correct. When you have a strong hand, you want to build the pot on every street. Flop, turn, river. Don't slow down because you're worried about scaring them off. Against this player type, that fear is rarely justified. The mistake players make against calling stations is betting small because they're afraid of a fold that was never going to happen anyway. That's leaving money on the table. Overbetting is also viable in spots where your hand is very strong and the board favors your range. Because calling stations call large bets without tightening up, an overbet that would fold out most opponents will still get called here. You're not trying to balance your range against this player. You're just trying to get as many chips in as possible when you're ahead. Thin value is another adjustment worth making. Against a tighter, more disciplined player, betting a marginal hand for value carries risk because they fold worse and call with better. Against a calling station, the calculus shifts. They call with a wide enough range that hands you'd normally check for pot control can become profitable bets. The key is having a reasonable read that your hand is still ahead of what they're likely to hold. The other side of this is bluffing, and the adjustment here is simple. Do it less. Bluffing works when your opponent folds. A calling station doesn't fold. Most bluffs you fire into them are bets you're making without the equity to back it up, against a player who's likely to call it down anyway. Multi-street bluffs tend to be especially costly. Each street adds more chips to a pot you're unlikely to win. There are occasional spots where a bluff makes sense against a calling station. If the board texture shifts dramatically in a way that should scare their range, or if they show genuine signs of weakness beyond their normal passive behavior, a single bet might be justified. But those spots are rare, and the default should be to not bluff this player. Their own betting tells you something useful too. Calling stations bet infrequently. When they do bet or raise, it usually means they have something real. Don't talk yourself into a hero call against a player who's been passive for an hour and suddenly wakes up with aggression. The discipline required here is recognizing that your edge against this player type comes entirely from value. Protect that edge by keeping your bluff frequency low and letting your strong hands do the work across all three streets. Chapter 3: Isolation Play with Premium Hands. You know who you're looking for. The next step is making sure you're the one who ends up in a pot with them, and that when you do, the situation is shaped in your favor from the start. When a weak player limps, they're giving you an opening. Your job is to take it before anyone else at the table gets involved. Your job is to make that cheap flop expensive, and to do it in a way that pushes out everyone else at the table so it's just you and them. The goal of an isolation raise is to reduce the field. You want to go heads up against the weaker player, not against a tough opponent, while the weak one tags along for the ride. A multi-way pot introduces variables you don't control. Someone else can flop a set, pick up a draw, and complicate your decisions. When you narrow it down to one opponent, especially one who plays passively and calls wide, your premium hand gets to realize its equity much more cleanly. Premium hands like pocket aces or pocket kings carry strong pre-flop equity on their own. That equity erodes when more players see the flop. Isolating preserves it. You're not just building the pot. You're shaping the situation so your hand's strength has the most room to matter. Now sizing. This is where a lot of players undercut themselves. Against a single limper, a standard open raise is usually not enough. You're not opening from first position into an empty field. There's already dead money in the pot, and there are other players left to act behind you who might call or squeeze. A common adjustment is to add roughly one big blind to your raise for each limper. If your standard open is 3 big blinds and there's one limper, you're looking at something closer to 4 big blinds. With 2 limpers, 5 big blinds. The logic is straightforward. You need a larger raise to accomplish the same goal, which is getting everyone except your target to fold. Opponent tendencies matter here too. If the limper is the type who'll call almost any raise, a larger size still builds the pot and keeps you in control. You're not trying to fold them. You're trying to fold the players behind you. If the players behind are tight and likely to fold anyway, you have more flexibility. But if there are other loose players in the field, sizing up protects you from building a multi-way pot by accident. Raising too large does carry a trade-off. There's a point where the size commits a disproportionate share of your stack before the flop. With pocket aces, that's rarely a problem. As your hand strength decreases toward the lower end of your isolation range, it's worth keeping that threshold in mind. Once your head's up on the flop, position becomes your biggest asset. When you're acting last, you see what your opponent does before you have to decide anything. That information is valuable, and it compounds over multiple streets. Isolation plays are easier to continue on the flop when you have position, because you can respond to what you see rather than committing chips blind. Continuation betting after an isolation play makes sense for a few reasons. You've represented strength pre-flop, and many flops won't connect cleanly with a passive limper's range. A well-sized bet puts them to a decision with whatever they flopped, and a player who calls wide pre-flop will often call wide on the flop too. Board texture matters here. On dry boards, you can bet smaller and still apply pressure. On wet boards, a larger bet charges draws and clarifies where you stand. When your opponent calls the flop and you're still ahead, the question becomes whether to continue on the turn. If the turn doesn't change the texture dramatically, and your read on the opponent is that they're floating with weak pairs or draws, a second barrel is often correct. You're applying consistent pressure, and a player without a strong hand will often face a decision that becomes too expensive to continue with. The sizing and frequency of each barrel should reflect what you know about that specific opponent. A player who folds to continuation bets often needs less pressure. A player who calls everything needs you to have a genuine hand when you fire. Chapter 4: The Art of the Semi-Bluff. There's a category of bet that most players underuse. It's not a value bet, and it's not a pure bluff. It lives in the space between those two, and it's structurally more powerful than either one on its own. It's a bet or raise with a hand that isn't strong yet, but has a genuine path to becoming strong. That distinction matters more than it might seem at first. A pure bluff has one way to win. Your opponent folds, or you lose. A semi-bluff has two ways to win. Your opponent concedes, or you improve on the next card and take the pot that way. That second path is what gives the semi-bluff its structural advantage. You're not just applying pressure. You're also holding real equity in the pot, even when that pressure doesn't work. This is one reason semi-bluffing tends to be more profitable over time than pure bluffing in most situations. When a pure bluff gets called, it's nearly always a loss. When a semi-bluff gets called, you still have outs. Those outs have value. They convert into winning pots at a rate that keeps the play profitable, even in the spots where your opponent doesn't give up. The bet is doing two jobs at once, and that's the core of why this move belongs in your game. It also helps with range balance. When you mix drawing hands into your aggressive lines, opponents can't easily separate your strong made hands from your semi-bluffs. That makes your entire betting range harder to play against, which is a side benefit that compounds over many hands. Now, not every board is equally good for a semi-bluff. Board texture has a direct effect on how much fold equity you're working with, and this equity is what makes the first path to winning viable. On boards with high cards and coordinated straight or flush possibilities, your perceived range as the aggressor tends to look strong. Opponents worry you've connected. That fear leads them to concede, and folds are what you want when your hand isn't made yet. Coordinated boards also tend to give you actual draws to work with, which means your semi-bluff has real outs behind it. Dry, disconnected boards with low cards are trickier. On those boards, your credible drawing hands are fewer. Opponents holding any kind of made hand, even a weak one, feel more secure because the board doesn't threaten them as much. They're less likely to back down, which reduces the value of the first path. You still have the second path if you're holding a draw, but with fewer outs available on dry boards, that path is narrower too. Dry boards aren't impossible for semi-bluffing, but they require more caution about what you're actually representing. Turn cards that shift the board dramatically in your favor can also create strong semi-bluff opportunities. If a turn card completes an obvious straight or adds a significant overcard to a board where your opponent likely holds a small pair, their confidence in their hand drops. That's a spot where a well-timed semi-bluff can encourage opponents to relinquish their hands. The draw type you're holding matters just as much as the board. Open-ended straight draws and flush draws are the strongest semi-bluff candidates because they carry substantial equity when called. Against a typical one-pair hand, a flush draw carries roughly 9 outs and an open-ended straight draw carries 8 outs. Either draw wins the pot a meaningful portion of the time when cards remain to come. That equity is real money working for you even when your opponent doesn't fold. Combination draws, where you hold both a flush draw and an open-ended straight draw at the same time, are even stronger. A combo draw can carry as many as 15 outs against a made hand, which represents a genuine equity advantage even when called, which means you're in better shape if called, and you can apply more pressure with more confidence. These are the hands where aggressive semi-bluffing lines have the most robust expected value. Gut shots and weak flush draws are more marginal. A gut shot carries 4 outs, and a weak flush draw may carry fewer than the standard 9 if some of your suit cards are already on the board or likely held by opponents. Fewer outs means less equity when called, which shifts the semi-bluff's profitability more heavily onto fold equity alone. They're not automatic folds as semi-bluff candidates, but you need the board texture and your opponent's range to support a higher fold rate to make those lines work. There's also a category of drawing hands that have essentially no showdown value at all. Suited connectors that completely missed the flop but picked up a draw are a good example. Checking and hoping to realize your outs passively keeps the pot small. It also gives your opponent an easy path to winning with whatever marginal hand they're holding. Betting converts your drawing equity into immediate pressure. It gives your hand an alternative path to victory instead of just one. That's the underlying logic. It's not about deception for its own sake. It's about recognizing when your hand carries enough equity that aggression becomes the higher value choice. Chapter 5: Adjusting to Aggressive Players. Some players hand you the initiative and wait to see what you do with it. Others take it from you before you've had a chance to think. The player who 3-bets wide and continuation bets at high frequency isn't giving you room to breathe. They're forcing decisions on their schedule, not yours. The adjustments you make against them are different in almost every way from what worked against passive opponents. Start with your pre-flop range. When facing a player who 3-bets frequently, the weakest hands in your opening range become liabilities. Hands like offsuit connectors and weak-suited aces look fine against a player who calls and lets you see a flop cheaply. Against a frequent three-better, those hands get squeezed out of profitability. Either you fold to the three-bet and lose your open, or you call out of position with a hand that doesn't connect cleanly enough to justify the pressure you'll face post-flop. The adjustment is to trim those hands from your continuing range and concentrate on holdings that either dominate what the aggressive player is likely to have or hold up well across many board textures. That means favoring strong pocket pairs, premium broadways, and suited hands with genuine high card strength. These hands give you something to work with when the pot gets large. They make strong top pairs and overpairs on high card boards, which are exactly the boards an aggressive opponent tends to continuation bet into you. Holding a hand that connects firmly with those boards allows you to continue with confidence instead of guessing. In 6-max games especially, a common and effective response to a frequent 3-better is to 4-bet with a value-heavy range. The goal isn't to bluff. Instead, 4-bet because you've tightened your range enough that most of what you're continuing with has a genuine equity advantage over what a wide 3-better is representing. That equity advantage is what makes the 4-bet profitable rather than just aggressive. Position shapes nearly every one of these decisions. Where you sit relative to an aggressive player is one of the most important factors you can control. If they're acting after you on most streets, you're going to face repeated pressure without information. You'll bet. They'll raise. Then you'll have to decide without knowing what they're planning next. That's a difficult spot to be in repeatedly. Sitting to their left reverses the dynamic. They act before you post-flop in most situations, which means you get to see what they do before you commit chips. That informational advantage compounds over many streets and many hands. When in position against an aggressive opener, flat calling pre-flop is a legitimate option with a wider set of hands than you'd use out of position. The reason isn't just to see a flop. Acting last on the flop, turn and river lets you manage pot size, pick off bluffs, and extract value more efficiently. Out of position, those same hands become harder to play. You'll often be leading into a player who's going to raise you, or checking to a player who's going to bet into you regardless. Folding more marginal holdings from early position against aggressive players isn't weakness. It's recognizing that you're giving up equity every time you play a difficult hand in a structurally bad spot. 3-betting from the button or cutoff against an aggressive opener combines two advantages at once. Applying pressure with a strong range from a position where post-flop decisions are easier to manage regardless of how the board runs out. The approach shifts when holding a genuinely strong hand against one of these players. The instinct is to build the pot immediately. But against an opponent who's going to build it for you, that instinct can cost you value. Trap lines work specifically because aggressive players don't need much encouragement to bet. If you check a strong but not highly vulnerable made hand, a player who continuation bets at high frequency will often put money in anyway. Checking tends to cost you very little in those spots. You've just let them take the lead. Flat calling a 3-bet with a premium hand rather than 4-betting is another version of this. You keep their bluffing range in the pot. Their marginal value hands stay in too. And you do it in spots where you have a clear equity advantage. The goal is to let the pot grow on their initiative rather than yours, so that when you do put in a large raise or a check raise on a later street, they've already committed enough chips that folding feels expensive. These trap lines work best on dry boards where giving a free card carries limited risk. On a board with flush and straight draw possibilities, checking strong hands is more dangerous because the card that comes off might change the equity picture significantly. On a board with little draw potential, patience tends to be lower risk. Let them fire. Let the pot grow. Then pick your moment. The patience required here is real. Aggressive players can make you feel like you need to respond immediately to every bet. But sometimes the highest value line is letting them do the work. Chapter 6: Maximizing Profit from Tight Players. Some players at the table are barely playing. They fold hand after hand. When they do enter a pot, they're almost always holding something real. That pattern is readable, and readable patterns can be taken advantage of. The first thing you want to confirm is how narrow their range actually is. Watch how often they voluntarily put chips in preflop. That number tends to run low for tight players, sometimes well below the table average. Their preflop raise frequency is also low relative to how often they enter pots, which tells you they're not building pots light. When they do raise, they're weighted towards strong holdings. When they face a raise and continue, that range gets even narrower. A tight player who 3-bets you back is very often doing it with a hand that dominates most of what you're holding. That information is useful in both directions. The more important point is what happens when you put pressure on them and they don't have that strong hand, which is most of the time. They fold. That's the key to gaining an edge. Blind stealing against this player type is one of the cleanest edges available. From the button or cutoff, raising wide already makes sense positionally. Against tight blinds, the case gets stronger. Their fold-to-steal percentage tends to run high. They're not defending wide ranges out of position. They're waiting for hands that justify the investment, and most of the time, they won't have one. The sizing you use here doesn't need to be large. A smaller open, something like 2.5 big blinds, risks fewer chips to accomplish the same goal. Because players with this profile tend to fold based on hand strength rather than pot odds, a smaller raise often achieves a similar fold frequency to a larger one. You're not trying to price out draws or build a pot. You're trying to take the blinds with minimal exposure. Keeping the size down means that when a tight player does wake up with a hand and 3-bets you, you've committed fewer chips before folding. Timing matters too. A player with this profile, who's been folding for an extended stretch, is in a pattern. They're not actively looking for spots to get involved. Raising into them in late position when the table is folding around to you is a high percentage spot. The situation confirms what their behavior already suggests. Consistent blind stealing against tight players accumulates chips in a way that's easy to underestimate. No single steal is large. But over a full session, picking up the blinds and antes from players who won't fight back adds up to a meaningful edge. The more nuanced adjustment involves what happens when you're in a hand with a tight player post-flop. Because their range is narrow, their betting patterns carry more information than they would from a looser opponent. When a tight player bets into you, they're more likely than not to have something. When they check, they're often genuinely uncertain or weak. That second situation is where you can create pressure. Checking back in position against a tight player can sometimes produce a bet from them on a later street. When they perceive weakness, some tight players will try to take the pot. It doesn't happen often. But when you've shown no aggression and the pot is meaningful, the conditions are there. Their bet on the turn or river can be called or raised with hands that have genuine showdown value. That word occasionally matters here. Inducing bluffs from tight players is a lower frequency play than it would be against an aggressive opponent. You're not engineering it every hand. You're recognizing when the conditions are right and using your passive line to create the opening. Thin value is also more available against a player with this profile than it might initially seem. Their range is narrow, so when they call, they're usually holding something real. But if your hand figures to be ahead of the specific portion of their range that calls, the bet is still correct. You're targeting a narrow set of continuing hands, and if you beat most of them, the bet has value. The balance here is staying aggressive enough to take what's available without turning your entire strategy into a bluff-heavy approach. Tight players fold a lot, but when they don't fold, they have a hand. Recognizing this pattern allows you to adjust your strategy effectively. Chapter 7. Navigating multi-way pots. 3 players in a hand is a different game than 2. The combined weight of multiple ranges means someone has almost always connected with the board in a meaningful way. That single fact reshapes what you can defend, what you can bet, and how fast you want the pot to grow. Start with hand selection. The ranges that work fine heads up start to break down when a third or fourth player enters the pot. Offsuit Broadway hands are a good example. Ace-King offsuit, King-Queen offsuit, hands like that. In a heads-up pot, they make top pair frequently, and that top pair is often good. In a multi-way pot, they still make top pair at the same rate, but now that one pair hand is competing against multiple ranges and the more players involved, the more likely it is that at least one of those ranges has flopped 2 pair, a set, or a stronger top pair. The hand didn't get weaker in isolation, it got weaker relative to the field. Suited connectors and other speculative hands move in the opposite direction, though only partially. Their implied odds can increase when the pot grows naturally from multiple callers, and when they connect hard, there's a better chance someone will pay them off. The challenge is equity realization. Getting to showdown cleanly with a flush or a straight is harder when more players are applying pressure or drawing to better hands. Stack depth and position both shape how much of that equity you can actually capture. A speculative hand in position, with deep stacks behind, has a meaningfully better chance of realizing its equity than the same hand out of position in a shallow pot. The practical adjustment is tighter continuing ranges across the board, both pre-flop and post-flop. 3 betting ranges in spots where multi-way pots are likely should become more linear. That means leaning on hands that hold strong equity even when called by multiple players. Bluff-heavy 3-bet ranges lose a lot of their value when there are more players to get through. Post-flop, defending against aggression requires stronger equity than it would heads up, because your equity against the field is genuinely lower. Pot odds are where a lot of players go wrong in these spots. Pot odds are the ratio of the current pot to the cost of a call. That part is straightforward. What they don't tell you is your actual equity against the field. They tell you what equity you need to break even on the call. In a multi-way pot, your equity with a given hand is often lower than it looks because several opponents are still drawing or already ahead. Favorable pot odds can be misleading if your actual equity doesn't hold up against multiple continuing ranges. The pot being large doesn't mean your call is correct. It means the call is correct only if your equity justifies it, and in multi-way pots that equity tends to be lower than it would be heads up with the same hand. Recognizing when pot odds no longer compensate for that equity dilution is a real skill. It's the difference between a disciplined fold and a call that feels mathematically reasonable but isn't. When several opponents are in the hand and all of them have ranges that connect with the board, your draw or marginal made hand is in a worse position than the raw pot odds suggest. Pot size control is the third piece. In multi-way pots, the standard approach to bet sizing shifts. Large bets and high betting frequencies make less sense when you're up against multiple players who are more likely to have strong holdings. The risk of building a large pot without the hand to justify it is higher. So players tend to check more often and use smaller bet sizes when they lack a clear advantage. With draws or medium-strength hands, a smaller bet accomplishes two things. It keeps the pot from growing too fast, and it still applies some pressure to weaker parts of the field. That's a reasonable trade-off. With strong value hands like two-pair, sets, or straights, you can justify larger sizing because you're building a pot with the equity to support it. The key distinction is that in multi-way pots, one-pair hands generally don't qualify for large pot building. They're hands you want to get to showdown with, not hands you want to bloat the pot with. The betting ranges that work in multi-way pots tend to be more value-heavy and less bluff-heavy by design. Fewer no-equity bluffs means the pot grows more slowly and more deliberately. This approach isn't passive. It's a recognition that uncontrolled pot growth without strong equity is a losing pattern when multiple opponents are involved. Position still matters. Stack depth still matters. But the baseline adjustment in multi-way pots stays consistent across both. You need stronger hands to continue, more skepticism about pot odds that look favorable on the surface, and deliberate control over how fast the pot grows. Chapter 8: The Check-Raise Bluff. The sequence takes 3 actions. You check, your opponent bets, and then you raise. What looks mechanical on the surface carries a lot of strategic weight underneath it. A check-raise bluff works because it flips the initiative. Your opponent bet likely because they expected to control the hand. When you raise, you take that control away from them. You've already let them commit chips, and now you're making the decision much larger. This is the ambush quality at work. You didn't lead out. You waited, let them commit, and then made the decision much harder than they expected. The immediate effect is that your opponent has to respond to a raise they didn't expect while holding a hand that may not be strong enough to continue. Many medium-strength hands, the kind that might have called a small lead bet, tend to struggle against a check raise. The pot grows faster than it would have through normal betting, and your fold equity increases with it. The situations where this play makes the most sense are fairly specific. You're usually out of position in a heads-up pot against the pre-flop raiser. That player has a natural tendency to continuation bet when you check to them, because checking out of position often looks like weakness. If your opponent bets frequently in that spot, regardless of how the board connects with their hand, that tendency becomes a useful trigger for the check raise. Board texture matters a lot here. Coordinated boards that include flush draws or straight draw possibilities give you more credible holdings to represent. When you check raise a board with that kind of texture, your opponent has to consider that you might have a strong draw or a made hand that connects well with those cards. Dry boards can work too, but only when the texture genuinely favors your perceived range over theirs. If the board looks like it missed a typical pre-flop raiser's range, a check raise can represent exactly the kind of hand they'd be most concerned about. Stack depth shapes how much pressure you can actually apply. Deeper stacks mean a check raise creates a much larger implied threat for the rest of the hand. Your opponent isn't just deciding whether to call one raise. They're deciding whether they want to play a large pot across multiple streets against someone who just showed strength. This pressure is part of what makes the play work. In shallower stack situations, the leverage shrinks, and so does the fold equity. Multi-way pots are generally the wrong environment for this play. The more players in the hand, the higher the chance that at least one of them has a strong enough holding to continue. The check-raise bluff depends on your opponent being uncertain and risk-averse. Creating that uncertainty is much harder when there are 2 or 3 other people in the pot. Now, the play only stays effective if your opponents can't read it cleanly. If you check-raise only when you have a strong made hand, observant opponents will eventually notice. Once they do, they'll fold to your check-raises when they're bluffs and call, or re-raise when they sense you're weak. This is the problem with being one-dimensional. Balancing means your check-raising range includes both strong hands and bluffs. Semi-bluffs fit naturally here, hands with genuine draw equity that give you a way to continue if called. When your check-raises can represent either a strong made hand or a draw with real equity, your opponent has no clean way to respond. Calling becomes expensive against your value hands. Folding gives you the pot when you're bluffing. This balance is what you're building when you construct a balanced range. Reading your opponent informs when to pull the trigger. An opponent who consistently folds to check raises after making small continuation bets is giving you a clear signal. An opponent who calls down with marginal hands frequently is a much harder target. Tracking those tendencies over the course of a session gives you an informational edge that makes the timing of your check-raise bluffs more precise. The play itself is straightforward, but the judgment required to use it well is not. Consider how each decision point in the hand can shift the balance of power, and remember that every check is an opportunity to turn the tables. Chapter 9. Exploiting Positional Advantage. Before a single card is dealt, some players at the table already hold an advantage. It has nothing to do with what they're holding. It comes from where they're sitting and when they have to act. The core mechanic is simple. When you act last, you see what everyone else does before you have to decide anything. On the flop, the turn, and the river, that sequence of information accumulates. A check from your opponent reveals their hesitation. A small bet indicates cautious engagement. A large bet signals strong intent. By the time it's your turn, you've already collected a read on their likely range and confidence level. An out-of-position player never gets that. They have to act into uncertainty every time. This informational edge is what makes wider ranges viable from late position. It's not that the hands themselves are stronger. It's that you can manage them more profitably when you know what you're responding to. A hand that's genuinely difficult to play from under the gun becomes much more workable on the button because you'll have context before you have to commit chips. Over many hands, that difference in context is what separates a losing spot from a profitable one. The button sits at the top of that hierarchy for exactly this reason. The earliest seats to the left of the big blind sit at the bottom because those players must act with the least information on every street. This structural gap doesn't shrink based on card strength. It persists across every hand regardless of what you're dealt. When you're in position and an opponent checks to you, you have a genuine choice. You can bet or you can check behind. That optionality is valuable on its own. But the more important point is that you can bet a wider range of hands in that spot because you've already confirmed their weakness. They checked. That action narrows their range and tells you they're not confident. A player who bets into you from out of position is giving you information, but they're also forcing you to respond without knowing what comes next. A player who checks is handing you control. Aggression becomes most effective from position in these scenarios. When opponents check frequently, the right response is to increase your bet frequency. Not recklessly, but deliberately. You're exploiting a pattern. If they're not betting, they're likely not strong, and betting into that weakness applies pressure they have to respond to without seeing your next action. When you bet the flop and they call, then check the turn, you have another opportunity. Each bet in that sequence forces a new decision from a player who's already shown reluctance to take the lead. Larger bet sizes on favorable boards amplify this. When the board connects well with a range you'd plausibly have from late position, and your opponent is out of position with a marginal hand, a larger sizing makes it harder for them to continue. They're not just deciding whether to call once. They're deciding whether to commit to a hand across multiple streets against a player who has seen every one of their actions before acting. Post-flop control is the other side of this. Aggression from position isn't always about applying maximum pressure. Sometimes the highest value line is controlling how large the pot gets. With a strong hand, you can build the pot street by street after watching your opponent's action. If they bet small, you can raise or call and reassess. If they check, you can bet to build value. You're always responding to real information, rather than guessing. This is what makes value extraction more efficient from position. You're not just betting strong hands. You're sizing those bets based on what your opponent has already told you. With a medium-strength hand, the same principle works in reverse. Checking back on the turn after a flop check keeps the pot small, reduces variance, and sometimes induces a bluff on the river from an opponent who reads your check as weakness. You've gathered 2 streets of information and kept the pot at a size that matches your actual hand strength. Such discipline is only available to you because you act last. On the river, acting last means you make the final decision with the complete picture. You've seen every action your opponent has taken across all 3 streets. You know whether they've been passive, whether they've shown aggression, and whether their bet sizing has been consistent. This full sequence is what allows you to make accurate decisions about going for thin value, checking behind to protect your range, or folding to a credible line. Playing in position doesn't guarantee you win more hands. It guarantees you face fewer genuinely difficult decisions than your opponent does. Over time, that asymmetry is where the edge lives. Chapter 10. The impact of table dynamics. Every time a player sits down or stands up, the dynamics shift noticeably. That's not a minor adjustment. It's a reset of the ecosystem you've been building reads on for the past hour. When a loose, curious recreational player takes the seat of a tight regular who just left, the average number of players seeing flops tends to climb. Pots that were heads up start going 3 or 4 ways. Hand selection standards across the table loosen because players sense softer resistance. The tight regular's absence leaves a void in the aggression balance, and that void gets filled differently depending on who replaces them. The arrival of a highly aggressive player does the opposite. A table that was limping most hands and playing passively will start seeing more pre-flop raises and 3 bets per orbit once that player settles in. Existing players feel the pressure and shift. Some tighten up. Some start 3-betting back. The whole pre-flop texture can change, and it tends to change quickly. A large stack joining the table adds another layer. The potential pot sizes grow. That draws more action toward that player's pots and raises the cost of every confrontation near them. There's also a subtler version of this. When one visibly frustrated player starts playing many more hands than they were an hour ago, the table often loosens around them. Other players sense the opportunity and start entering more marginal pots. You don't need a new player to arrive for the dynamic to shift. A change in mood is enough. The way you track these shifts is through betting patterns. Not individual hands, but patterns across multiple orbits. An increase in multi-way limped pots over several orbits tells you the table has moved toward passivity. Consistently large pre-flop open raises from a specific seat signal an aggressive influence taking hold. Frequent 3-bets from late position against early opens tell you the pre-flop environment is trending toward confrontation. These aren't isolated observations. They're signals about the direction the table is moving. Post-flop patterns carry the same information. Repeated small continuation bets from several players over time suggest a high-frequency, low-sizing approach at work. That pattern could reflect cautious play or a deliberate sizing strategy. You'll want to assess it alongside what those players are showing at showdown before drawing conclusions. A sudden shift toward large river bets across multiple hands is one possible signal that players are beginning to polarize their ranges more strongly. It can also reflect exploitative value betting or simply a change in player mood. The point is to track the pattern, not to assume a single cause. Tracking how often players call raises out of position across many hands gives you a read on whether the table tends to reward tight or loose pre-flop play. If out-of-position callers are wide and sticky, isolation plays and thin value lines tend to become more profitable. If they're folding most of the time, your opening ranges can widen and your stealing frequency can increase. Once you've identified a shift, the adjustment has to happen in real time. A newly seated aggressive player, who is 3-betting frequently and building large pots before the flop, suggests reducing your pre-flop raising frequency. You're not giving up initiative permanently. You're avoiding unnecessary confrontations until you have a clearer picture of their tendencies and can trap them with stronger holdings. With multiple tight opponents to your left folding most hands without defending, widening your opening range from early and middle position becomes justified. The resistance that would normally punish those hands isn't there anymore. A very passive table means isolating limpers rather than entering multi-way pots becomes a higher priority line. You're not just picking up dead money. You're removing the field and creating a situation where your positional advantage and post-flop reads tend to matter more. Opponents folding quickly to continuation bets on dry boards means increasing your continuation bet frequency on those textures for a period makes sense. You're extracting value from a pattern that exists right now, not from a pattern that existed an hour ago. Frequent large river bets suggest tightening your calling range with marginal bluff catchers is a reasonable response. The game is telling you something about how players are using their ranges on the final street. The reads you build in the first hour don't stay accurate. The environment you're in now is not the same as when you first sat down. Staying profitable means updating your model of the game continuously, rather than playing against a version that no longer exists. Chapter 11. Countering the continuation bet. When a pre-flop raiser fires a continuation bet, they're representing the board. The question you need to answer isn't whether they have a hand. It's whether their range is strong enough to justify the story they're telling. That distinction is where countering the continuation bet begins. Floating is the first tool. You call the flop with a hand that doesn't have strong made hand value yet, and you do it with a plan to take the pot away on a later street. The call itself isn't passive. It's a deliberate choice to stay in the hand and gather information while letting the opponent's perceived strength work against them. When a player c-bets at high frequency, many of those bets are disconnected from the board. They're buying the pot with position and initiative, not with cards. Floating exploits that. You're not calling because you think you're ahead right now. You're calling because you expect to take control when they slow down. This works best when you're in position. Acting last on the turn means you see whether they continue or check before you have to commit another chip. A check on the turn is information. It can signal that the flop bet was more about initiative than hand strength, though it doesn't always mean that. That's often your opening. Hands that work well as floats usually have some equity attached. Something like a backdoor flush draw, an overcard or two, or a gut shot that might develop on the turn. You're not calling with nothing. You're calling with a hand that has enough going for it to justify the price, while also having the right structure to represent strength on later streets if the board shifts in your favor. The turn is where the pressure sharpens. When you've called the flop and your opponent checks the turn, you can take the pot right there with a well-timed bet. But there's a more aggressive option available when the situation supports it. If your opponent bets the turn after c-betting the flop, a raise can put them in a difficult spot. You've already shown willingness to continue. Now you're telling them their range is too weak to stand up to more heat. A turn raise after a called flop c-bet works best in specific conditions. First, the opponent needs to be the type who bets wide on the flop but doesn't have the stomach to continue facing aggression on later streets. They'll fire the flop because that's automatic for them. The turn bet is smaller, more tentative. That sizing tells you something. A noticeably small turn bet often means a capped range. They're not building a pot with a strong hand. They're trying to keep the price low because they're not confident. That's when a raise puts them in an uncomfortable spot. Board texture matters here too. When the turn card changes the board in a way that hits your perceived range harder than theirs, the raise carries more credibility. A flush card arriving when you've called a dry flop from in position now gives you a convincing story. Their range doesn't include many hands that want to play a large pot on that turn. Yours, as far as they know, might. Stack depth is a factor as well. The raise needs to create meaningful pressure without immediately committing you to playing for stacks unless you're prepared for that outcome. When the stack-to-pot ratio still gives you leverage, the raise can force folds from hands that would have called a river bet. That's the core value of the move. You're capturing fold equity at a point in the hand where your opponent still has a decision to make, rather than waiting until the river when pot sizes can become harder to navigate. Range evaluation runs underneath all of this. Both moves require a working estimate of what your opponent actually holds. Start with their pre-flop range given the position they raised from. Then filter it through the flop texture. On a dry, high-card board, a frequent c-better will bet most of their range, which means the range is wide and includes plenty of air. On a wet, coordinated board, a player who still bets is more likely to be narrower and stronger. They're less likely to fire into a board that hits calling ranges unless they have something real. Sorting the range into strong hands, draws, marginal holdings, and air gives you a framework for deciding which counter to use. Against a range that's mostly air and marginal hands, floating and applying turn pressure is high value. Against a range that's genuinely strong, floating becomes more expensive, and raising the turn becomes a commitment you need to be prepared to back up. The mistake most players make is treating the flop c-bet as the end of the hand's decision tree. It's not. It's the beginning of a sequence where the real leverage often lives one street later. Chapter 12. The Reverse Tell Strategy. Something leaks out, an opponent picks it up, and you're already behind. This is the standard model. Most players spend their energy trying to suppress that leak. A reverse tell starts from a different premise entirely. You're not trying to hide what's happening. You're deciding what your opponent is going to see. The distinction matters. A natural tell leaks out because you can't fully suppress your reactions under pressure. A reverse tell is chosen. You're picking a behavior because you know how your opponent will read it, and that reading is exactly what you want them to get wrong. The goal isn't deception for its own sake. It's to induce a specific response. You want your opponent to call when you're strong, or fold when you're weak, based on a signal you planted. This is the practical difference between concealment and manipulation. Concealment leaves a gap. Manufactured information fills it with something that points the wrong direction. In live cash games, the available channels are wide. Body language, chip handling, eye contact, table talk, and betting tempo are all surfaces you can work with. The key principle across all of them is imitation. You're borrowing a behavior that already carries meaning at the table and attaching it to the opposite situation. If a common sign of weakness in your player pool is looking away from the board after betting, you can perform that behavior when you're actually strong. If players in your game tend to talk more when they're trying to induce a call with a weak hand, you can use table talk to suggest you want action when you're holding the nuts. Verbal cues deserve specific attention. If an opponent hears something that sounds like an invitation, something that reads as reluctance to get called, they may interpret that as strength and fold. Using table talk as a reverse tell can be effective. The behavior signals one thing. The reality is another. Consistency is what separates a one-time misdirection from a usable tool. A single instance doesn't register as a pattern. It takes repetition across enough hands for an opponent to start treating the behavior as reliable. Once they trust it, you've built something you can actually use. The deviation is where the payoff lives, but the repetition is what makes the deviation meaningful. Timing is where most of this falls apart or comes together. A reverse tell has the most impact when your opponent is genuinely uncertain. If they're already committed to calling, the signal doesn't move them. If they've already decided to fold, it doesn't matter either. The spot you're looking for is the one where they're sitting between two decisions and looking for something to tip them. This is when a manufactured behavior lands hardest. Observant opponents tend to be more useful targets for reverse tells than inattentive ones. A player who doesn't track behavior is unlikely to act on a signal you're projecting. A player who reads tells actively is far more likely to. They're already in the habit of translating behavior into hand strength. You're feeding that habit with false data. Watch how they respond after you've used a reverse tell. If they called and seemed surprised, the signal probably didn't land. If they folded and looked settled in their decision, they likely acted on what you gave them. That response tells you whether the false baseline is still holding, or whether it's starting to wear thin. This last point is a real risk. Poker tell analysis depends on comparing current behavior to established baseline behavior. If your reverse tell gets used too often, it stops being a deviation and becomes your new baseline. At that point, it's no longer misleading anyone. It's just readable. The behavior you designed to create a false narrative becomes the true one, and now you've handed your opponent a direct tell instead. Chapter 13. The River Bluff. There are no more cards to come. Whatever you put in, you either get back with interest or you lose outright. The finality of this stage changes the weight of every decision. It's what makes the river the most consequential street for bluffing, and it's also what makes reading the board correctly so important before you commit. Start with what the 5 community cards actually show you. A board that completes obvious draws changes the hands your opponent can credibly hold. When the river brings a third card of the same suit or fills a straight, you're looking at a texture that widens the set of strong hands they might have arrived at. Heavily connected boards concentrate strength in specific ways. Paired boards narrow it differently, pushing more of the weight toward full houses rather than straights or flushes. A dry, uncoordinated board tends to produce fewer strong combinations overall. None of this tells you exactly what your opponent has, but it informs you about how many combinations of strong hands are even possible given the final texture. Next, consider whose range the river card favors. It's not just about what draws completed. It's about which player's pre-flop and post-flop range is more plausible on this specific final board. If the river card fits naturally into the kinds of hands you'd represent given how you played the hand, that's a meaningful structural advantage. If the river card makes your story harder to tell, bluffing becomes more expensive in terms of credibility. You also want to notice when draws have missed. If the board showed flush draw possibilities on the flop and turn but the river doesn't complete them, that's information. A portion of your opponent's range that was drawing is now unimproved. Hands that were calling with equity and didn't get there are now likely weak. This shift in their range composition matters when you're deciding whether a bluff has a realistic chance to work. Now layer in everything that happened before the river. Your opponent's actions on every prior street tell you what their range can and cannot contain. A player who called pre-flop and then called bets on the flop and turn without raising is communicating something meaningful about their range. Aggressive lines on earlier streets, like check raises or large bets, tend to lean towards strong-made hands more often than not. Passive lines across multiple streets tend to be more consistent with draws or medium-strength holdings. When those draws miss the river, the passive caller's range gets weaker in a measurable way. Blockers matter here too. If you hold a card that would complete an opponent's most likely strong hand, that reduces the number of combinations they can actually have. This directly impacts how often you expect a bluff to work, and it's one of the reasons hand selection for bluffing on the river isn't arbitrary. The risk-reward structure of a river bluff is simple in principle. You're risking your bet to win the pot. The question is whether your opponent folds often enough to make that trade profitable. If the pot is 100 big blinds and you're betting 75, you need them to fold roughly 43% of the time to break even on the bluff itself. That comes from dividing the bet by the total pot after the bet lands, which is 75 divided by 175. The larger your bet relative to the pot, the higher that fold threshold becomes. Bet sizing on the river isn't just about applying pressure. It's about calibrating the risk you're taking against the fold frequency you can realistically expect. Large river bluffs into large pots carry the highest variance. There are no more streets to realize equity. If you're wrong, you lose the full bet immediately. This exposure is real, and it's why the conditions need to be right before you commit to a big bluff. Bluffing smaller pots reduces the financial risk, but it also reduces the reward. The math scales together. Heads-up situations offer better conditions for river bluffing than multi-way pots. When there's only one opponent, you need one fold. When there are two or more, the probability that at least one of them has connected with the board in a meaningful way increases. This is not a reason to avoid bluffing in multi-way pots entirely. It is a reason to require stronger conditions before doing so. The line you represent has to be coherent from pre-flop through the river. If your betting pattern across all four streets doesn't match the story of a hand that would logically arrive at this river bet for value, your opponent has less reason to fold. Consistency in your line is what makes the bluff credible. A river bet that doesn't fit the narrative of the hand is harder to sell regardless of the board texture or the opponent's range composition. When those elements align, the river bluff stops feeling like a gamble and starts looking more like a calculated decision grounded in real information. Chapter 14. Capitalizing on Tilt. A player who just took a bad beat is broadcasting information. The question is whether you're positioned to receive it. That shift away from rational play shows up fast. The decisions keep coming, but they're no longer anchored to hand strength, pot odds, or position. They're driven by frustration, the need to recover losses quickly, or the impulse to prove something after being shown up. That shift creates exploitable patterns, and those patterns tend to show up in two places at once: their body and their betting. On the physical side, you're looking for changes from their prior baseline. A player who was sitting still and quiet is now fidgeting. They're handling chips more aggressively. You might notice visible tension in their jaw or shoulders. These aren't conclusions on their own. They're signals that something has changed internally. The betting behavior is where those signals get confirmed. A player who was folding to most pre-flop raises is now calling or three-betting with hands they'd never have played an orbit ago. Bet sizes stop making sense relative to the pot. Raises come in at sizes that don't fit the action around them. The pattern you established for that player earlier in the session is no longer holding. What you're tracking is the combination. Physical tells without betting changes might just be discomfort. Betting changes without physical tells might just reflect a style shift. When both move at the same time, you're likely looking at someone in that state. Once you've identified that shift, the first strategic adjustment is to your value betting frequency. They're calling too wide and entering too many pots. That means your value range gets thinner. Hands you'd normally check back to control the pot now warrant a bet, because the probability that they call with worse is meaningfully higher than it was before. You're not changing what constitutes a strong hand. You're adjusting downward the threshold at which betting becomes the higher expected value line. The second adjustment runs in the opposite direction. Bluffing frequency should drop. That player's calling range is wider and less disciplined, which means fold equity is lower. The structural conditions that make a bluff profitable depend on an opponent who responds to pressure by folding a reasonable portion of the time. They're not doing that. Firing thin bluffs into someone who's emotionally committed to calling tends to be a leak rather than a strategy. Three-betting frequency is worth increasing against someone who's limping into many pots with marginal holdings. You're not three-betting to fold them out. You're three-betting to build a pot with a range advantage against someone who's likely entering the hand with below-average holdings. The goal is to get heads up with them in a pot where their hand selection is poor and their post-flop decision-making is compromised. River bet sizing decisions against a tilted player require some care. When a tilted opponent starts making very large polarizing river bets, their range becomes genuinely unpredictable. Some players in that state are over-bluffing. Others are overvaluing made hands and betting big for the wrong reasons. You don't always know which. Adjusting your calling range in that spot depends on what you've observed from them specifically. There's no uniform answer, but staying aware that their river bet frequency and sizing have become unreliable is itself useful information. The broader opportunity comes from isolation. In a full ring game, a player limping into pots repeatedly is a spot to raise more often and get heads up with them before the field complicates things. Their tendency to chase draws without proper pot odds and to call large bets with dominated hands tends to create profitable situations that build across multiple hands. You're not looking for one big pot. You're looking for repeated exposure to a player whose decision-making is consistently below their own baseline. The discipline required on your side is real. Watching someone play erratically can create its own pressure. You might start loosening up in response. You could find yourself playing pots you shouldn't, or sizing incorrectly because the energy of the game has shifted. That's your own tilt creeping in. The edge against a tilted player comes from the contrast between their emotional state and your stability. The moment that contrast narrows, the advantage narrows with it. Keeping pots larger against a player who's already shown a tendency to call down light with second-best holdings is where the long-run profit accumulates. Not in one hand. Across the session. Chapter 15. Understanding bet sizing tells. Every player has a default. It's the size they reach for without thinking, the number that feels comfortable in a standard spot. You probably have one too. The interesting moment isn't when someone bets that number. It's when they don't. Start with what standard looks like. In most no-limit cash games, a standard open runs somewhere around 2.5 to 3 times the big blind. On the flop, a standard continuation bet tends to fall somewhere between half pot and 3/4 pot. Those sizes aren't arbitrary. They've become common because they accomplish something specific. They apply pressure while keeping the bet-to-pot ratio efficient. When you see those sizes, you're seeing a player operating within a normal strategic range. That doesn't tell you much about hand strength on its own. It just means they're not signaling anything unusual. The real insights emerge when players break from the expected pattern. A player who opens to 5 or 6 times the big blind from early position is doing something atypical. That kind of sizing, especially from a position where ranges are already expected to be narrow, often points toward a player who wants action with a strong hand, or who's uncomfortable with post-flop play and is trying to end the hand pre-flop. Neither interpretation is certain, but both are important to observe. Conversely, a min-raise pre-flop from an opponent who doesn't normally do that is worth noting. Some players min-raise with very strong hands hoping to build a pot slowly. Others do it with speculative hands trying to see a cheap flop. You won't know which category a specific player falls into until you've watched them do it more than once and seen what they show down. On the flop, oversized bets and undersized bets both carry signals. When a player bets more than the pot on a coordinated board, they're often polarizing their range. That bet tends to come from a hand that wants to deny equity now. It could be a strong made hand protecting against draws, or it could be a semi-bluff with enough equity to justify the size. A large flop bet on a wet board tends not to be a balanced action. It tends to indicate the player is committed to a specific outcome. On dry boards, smaller sizing is more consistent with modern strategy because the board doesn't heavily favor either player and a high-frequency small bet accomplishes the same pressure without overcommitting. A player using large bets on dry boards is often doing something less calibrated. That tendency is important to monitor. The undersized bet deserves equal attention. A flop bet that's roughly 10 to 15% of the pot functions, almost like a check. It's so small that it doesn't price out draws. It doesn't build the pot meaningfully. It doesn't apply real pressure. When you see that size, you're often looking at a player who wants to see what you'll do without risking much. That's a sign of uncertainty. Once you've confirmed the pattern across multiple hands, treating that bet as a weak action becomes more justified. Raising or floating in response starts to make sense. Combining sizing with context sharpens the read considerably. A large pre-flop raise from under the gun means something different than the same size from the button. The button raise could be part of a balanced range that includes a lot of hands. The under-the-gun raise with an unusual size more reliably points toward a narrower, stronger range. That player is already in a spot where standard strategy calls for caution. Position filters the meaning of the size. Once you've identified a reliable pattern in an opponent's sizing, you can start adjusting your responses systematically. Against a player who consistently uses large bets only when they have strong holdings, tightening your calling range against those bets tends to be the right response. You're not guessing at that point. You're acting on observed data. Against a player whose large bets include bluffs and semi-bluffs at a meaningful frequency, the same tightening would cost you too much. The adjustment has to match what you've actually seen, not what you assume. The risk in all of this is overconfidence. A player who makes a large river bet after a small flop bet and a small turn bet might be telling a coherent story of a slow-played strong hand. Or they might be a player whose sizing is genuinely random and doesn't correlate with anything. Some opponents are just inconsistent. Treating inconsistency as a pattern is a mistake that costs chips. Stay open to revising that read when new information contradicts it. Chapter 16: The Double Barreling Technique. Your opponent called the flop. The pot is bigger now, and the turn card is sitting there waiting for you to decide what it means. That second bet on the turn is the double barrel. It's a continuation of the story you started on the flop, and it carries more weight than the first bet did. Your opponent already called once. They've shown some willingness to continue. When you bet again, you're telling them that their call didn't discourage you, and that they now face a second decision with a pot that's grown larger. The primary function of the double barrel isn't to get calls from worse hands. It's to force folds from hands that have some equity, but not enough to justify continuing against two bets across two streets. Marginal made hands, weak draws, and speculative holdings all become harder to continue with when the pressure compounds. That's the core mechanism. The pot is bigger, the bet is real, and the opponent has to decide whether their hand is worth the investment a second time. This play works better in heads-up pots. When there's only one opponent, you're targeting one range. In a multi-way pot, the probability that at least one player has connected with the board increases meaningfully, and fold equity shrinks accordingly. The double barrel is a tool built for one opponent, not a field. Now the turn card itself matters a great deal. Not every turn card is equally good for a second barrel. The ones you want are cards that interact poorly with your opponent's likely flop calling range. If your opponent called the flop with a pair, a draw, or a speculative holding, you want a turn card that either makes their hand worse or makes it harder for them to feel confident about where they stand. Overcards to the board can serve this function, depending on how that card interacts with both ranges. If the overcard connects more naturally with the hands you'd be expected to hold than with the hands your opponent likely called with, it shifts the range advantage in your direction. A flush completing card can work similarly. If your perceived range contains more flush draw combinations than your opponent's calling range does, the flush card arriving on the turn is structurally better for you than for them. You get to represent the hand they're now afraid of. The key question is always whether the turn card weakens your opponent's range more than it weakens yours. A favorable answer gives you a better candidate for a second barrel, while an unclear or reversed answer suggests the double barrel carries less fold equity and more risk. Balancing this play between value and bluff is what keeps it from becoming exploitable. If you only double barrel when you have a strong hand, observant opponents will eventually read the second bet as a signal of strength and fold less. If you only double barrel as a bluff, they'll start calling you down more often. The unexploitable version of this play includes both. Value double barrels come from hands that improved on the turn, or from strong draws that now carry significant equity. You're betting because you want to build the pot, and because your hand can withstand a call. Bluff double barrels come from situations where the turn card, your perceived range, or your opponent's tendencies create enough fold equity to make the bet profitable without a strong holding. Blocker cards fit here too. When you hold a card that reduces the number of strong combinations your opponent can realistically have, that shifts the probability of a successful bluff in your favor. Assessing fold equity on the turn means thinking about what your opponent is likely to continue with. Their flop calling range is already filtered. They didn't raise, so the very strong hands are somewhat less likely. What they kept are the hands that had enough equity or showdown value to call once. Now you need to estimate how many of those hands can call again. An opponent with a high fold-to-turn continuation bet frequency is telling you directly that they struggle to continue against a second barrel. An opponent who calls down wide on every street is telling you the opposite. Stack depth plays into this as well. When stacks are deep relative to the pot, the implied threat of future streets adds pressure. When stacks are shallow, the math of continuing becomes simpler for your opponent, and fold equity decreases. The decision to fire a second barrel shouldn't be treated as automatic. It follows from the turn card, the opponent's tendencies, the range dynamics, and the balance between value and bluff in your overall approach. If these factors are in harmony, the second barrel can be a high-leverage play. Otherwise, checking back and reassessing might be the more prudent choice. Chapter 17. Effective hand ranges in 3-bet pots. The pot is already inflated before a single community card hits the felt. That compression reshapes every decision that follows, and it starts before either player has seen the board. The stack-to-pot ratio shifts immediately. In a single raised pot, you typically see the flop with significant stack depth relative to what's in the middle. In a 3-bet pot, that relationship is already compressed before the flop is dealt. Fewer streets remain where either player can maneuver freely, and pot-committed territory arrives earlier than it would otherwise. Range narrowing is the second consequence. Both players have communicated something about their holdings before the flop. Even against an opponent who 3-bets wide, both ranges are narrower than what you'd see in a limped pot or a single raised multi-way pot. That narrowing makes the board's interaction with each range more predictable on every street that follows. Against opponents who 3-bet frequently, you'll encounter these pots more often. A player with a high 3-bet frequency is generating inflated pots regularly, which means you need a clear framework for how you're responding before you sit down in those spots. Reacting without a plan tends to be how chips flow back to a player who's already put you under pressure. Your 3-bet calling range and your 3-betting range both need to account for position, effective stack depth, and what you know about the opponent. Position is especially important here. From early position, the range you're willing to 3-bet or call a 3-bet with should be tighter. You'll be out of position on every post-flop street, and that cost compounds quickly. From late position, you have more flexibility. Acting last on the flop, turn and river means you can continue with hands that would be difficult to play from early position. You'll have the information advantage before committing more chips. When you're deciding whether to build a polarized or merged 3-betting range, the opponent's tendencies should drive that decision. If they fold to 3 bets at a high rate, a polarized range captures more immediate fold equity. Conversely, when facing an opponent who calls wide and doesn't fold often, a merged range with strong equity is more effective because you'll be playing a lot of post-flop poker and you want hands that realize their equity well. Once you're in the hand post-flop, the compressed stack-to-pot ratio shapes how you think about continuation betting. You don't have as much room to build a story across 3 streets the way you might in a single raised pot. Each bet represents a bigger commitment due to the pot's size, so board texture and range advantage matter more on the flop in 3-bet pots than they do in shallower pre-flop investment scenarios. When the board connects well with your perceived range and appears to miss your opponent's likely holdings, continuation betting becomes straightforward. But the more interesting spots are when the board is ambiguous or when your opponent's range is hard to cap. In those cases, checking is a legitimate and sometimes stronger line. Checking in a 3-bet pot isn't passive by default. It can protect your range by keeping your checking range strong enough that opponents can't overbet into it freely. You might control the pot size when your hand has value but isn't strong enough to play for stacks. Additionally, it can induce aggression from an opponent who reads your check as weakness and bets into you with a worse hand. The most profitable post-flop spots in 3-bet pots tend to appear when your opponent's range looks capped. If their pre-flop calling range doesn't include many strong hands that connect with the board, and their post-flop behavior suggests they're not confident in their holding, that's where you can apply targeted pressure. Bet sizing in these spots should reflect the range dynamics, not just the hand you're holding. When your perceived range is strong and your opponent's appears weak, sizing that extracts value and denies equity at the same time becomes available to you. Adaptability tends to be what separates players who profit in 3-bet pots from those who struggle in them. The pre-flop investment doesn't lock you into a single post-flop line. Every street still offers choices. The right choice depends on how the board lands, how your opponent responds, and how your range interacts with theirs. Staying flexible within a structured framework is how you hold on to the edge that the 3-bet pot creates. Chapter 18. Utilizing the blocking bet. You've got a hand that can win at showdown, but you don't want to face a large bet to get there. Checking hands the decision to your opponent. Betting big builds a pot you're not comfortable with. So you put in a small bet instead, roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of the pot, and let your opponent decide what to do with it. The logic is simple. You're determining the cost before your opponent gets to. The key distinction here is what the blocking bet is not. It's not a value bet designed to build a pot. It's not a bluff designed to fold out a better hand. It's a pot control tool. You're using it because you hold a medium-strength hand that has genuine showdown value, but is vulnerable to a larger bet if you check. The small sizing is intentional. You're not trying to get 3 streets of value. You're trying to reach showdown without paying full price to get there. 2 things happen at once when you make this bet. You're capping the pot size by preemptively setting a lower price for moving forward. You're also gathering information based on how your opponent responds. Both of those outcomes come from the same action. The situations where a blocking bet tends to be most useful share a few common features. You're out of position. Your hand is decent, but not premium. And you have a reasonable belief that checking would lead to a bet you're not comfortable calling. On the turn, a blocking bet can also serve to cap the potential river pot. If your opponent just calls a small turn bet, you've already limited how large the final pot is likely to grow. On the river, the logic is more direct. You expect a check to induce a larger bet, so you take the lead first with a smaller sizing. Board texture and stack depth both factor into how useful the play is. On a board that favors your opponent's range, checking often invites aggression you can't profitably respond to. A blocking bet on that kind of board is a way to stay in the hand on your own terms. Stack depth matters because the play only makes sense when there's a meaningful difference between the size of your blocking bet and what your opponent would likely bet if you checked. If effective stacks are shallow enough that checking and calling costs roughly the same amount, the blocking bet doesn't accomplish much. What happens next depends entirely on how your opponent responds. Each response tells you something different. When an opponent folds, you win the pot without a showdown. That outcome is the simplest version of the play working. When an opponent calls, the hand usually reaches showdown with a controlled pot size. You got to see the result without paying the price your opponent would have set. The more complicated response is the raise. Some opponents, particularly observant ones, recognize a blocking bet as a signal that your range is capped or medium strength. They respond with a raise not because they necessarily have a monster, but because they've identified that your small bet communicates limited confidence in your hand. When that raise comes, you're now facing a decision for a larger amount than you intended to risk. That's the core risk of the play. You wanted to set a low price for staying in the hand, and instead you've opened a decision point that costs more than the blocking bet itself. How you respond to a raise depends on context. If your hand has enough showdown value to call off a raise, the math of the situation may still favor continuing. If the raise is large enough that calling puts a significant portion of your remaining stack at risk, folding is often the correct response. The blocking bet didn't fail in that scenario. It gave you information. You learned that your opponent has a hand strong enough to raise a small bet, which is exactly the kind of range compression that makes the play informative even when it doesn't work out the way you hoped. The adjustment to make over time is tracking which opponents treat your blocking bets as weakness signals and respond aggressively. Against those players, the play tends to become less reliable because they've identified your pattern. Against opponents who simply call or fold, the blocking bet generally accomplishes what it's designed to do: reach showdown for less than you'd have paid if you'd checked and let them dictate the cost. Chapter 19. The Overbet Bluff. Your opponent feels the pressure when you bet more than the pot. It's not just about choosing a size, it's a statement about what your range can credibly contain. That statement either holds up or it doesn't, and the entire play depends on whether the board and your prior actions support it. What makes the sizing different from a standard bluff is what it does to your opponent's decision. Standard sizing, whether half pot or 2/3 pot, leaves room for a wide range of marginal hands to continue without much discomfort. The overbet removes that room. Your opponent is suddenly facing a bet that demands a large portion of their stack for a single decision, and medium-strength hands become genuinely difficult to continue with. The psychological weight of that sizing is real. Most players hold medium-strength hands most of the time. One pair, weak two pair, a draw they held onto past its useful life. Against a standard bet, those hands have a reasonable call. Against an overbet, the math shifts and the discomfort compounds. That's the mechanism you're exploiting. The other structural element is range polarization. When you overbet, observant opponents don't put you on a medium hand. They put you on either a very strong holding or a bluff. That's generally the correct read against an attentive opponent, and it's also the read you want them to have.
Your goal is to make the strong hand side of that range credible enough that folding becomes the more likely response. That credibility comes from two things: how well the board fits your perceived holdings and your perceived range advantage.
Boards that strongly favor the pre-flop aggressor's range are the most natural spots.
If the board connects well with the hands you'd be expected to have, and poorly with the hands your opponent likely holds, the overbet story is coherent.
Paired boards are a useful example. If you can credibly represent trips or a full house, and your opponent is sitting with a one-pair hand, they face a genuinely uncomfortable decision. The same logic applies when a scare card arrives on the turn. A card that completes a possible straight or introduces a flush threat can make your range look much stronger, especially if you've shown aggression on earlier streets.
Dry, uncoordinated boards also create opportunities, though the logic works differently.
On a static board, hand strengths don't shift much between streets. If you hold a range advantage on the flop, that advantage is likely to persist. Overbetting on that texture reinforces the credibility of strong holdings because the board hasn't given your opponent many new ways to improve or reassess.
What you're looking for is a spot where you can represent many nutted hands while your opponent's likely range is capped at one pair or medium strength holdings.
When that asymmetry exists, the play has structural support. Frequency is where most players go wrong.
Overbetting too often against the same opponents makes the play readable.
If most of your large bets are bluffs, attentive players will start calling you wide.
If most of your large bets are value hands, they'll fold too often and you'll rarely get paid. The play requires a balanced mix of overbet value hands and overbet bluffs, so that opponents genuinely can't sort one from the other.
In practice, overbets should be used less often than standard sizing. They're a selective tool reserved for high leverage spots, not a default approach. The frequency you choose should also account for the opponent in front of you. If you've watched someone call large bets repeatedly with marginal hands, the overbet bluff is less likely to work against them. If you've watched someone fold to significant pressure when their range is capped, the conditions are more favorable.
Tracking those tendencies across the session is how you calibrate.
Multi-way pots are generally poor candidates. When multiple opponents are in the hand, the probability that everyone folds drops significantly. One player folding doesn't end the hand. You need all of them to fold, and that's a much harder outcome to achieve with a single large bet. Blockers add another layer of precision. Holding a card that reduces the combinations of strong hands your opponent can have makes the bluff more likely to succeed because their calling range is narrower than it might appear. The overbet bluff tends to work because it creates a decision that most hands struggle to justify calling. When the board supports your story, your perceived range advantage is meaningful, and your opponent's holdings are capped. The play creates pressure that standard sizing rarely can.
Chapter 20. The probe bet strategy.
When the pre-flop aggressor checks back on the flop, something shifts. They've passed on the initiative they built before the flop. That check communicates something about their range. It creates a specific opportunity for the player who called out of position. That opportunity is the probe bet strategy. The key structural detail is that the in-position player had the option to continue betting and declined. That declining action caps their range in a meaningful way. Strong hands generally benefit from building pots. When a player in position checks back, they're more likely holding something marginal, a hand they're comfortable controlling, rather than building with. The probe bet targets that limited range directly.
The primary purpose is information gathering.
You're out of position, which is already a structural disadvantage. The probe bet is one of the tools available to you for reclaiming initiative and learning where you stand before the hand gets deeper. A fold suggests the opponent had little. A call suggests they have something, but aren't confident enough to raise. A raise suggests they were trapping or hit the turn hard. Each response narrows the range you're working against. Identifying the right spots to probe requires reading the board in relation to both ranges. Probe bets tend to work best on turn cards that favor your perceived range as the caller, rather than the preflop raiser's range. If the turn card connects more naturally with the kinds of hands you'd call preflop with from out of position, that's a board texture that supports a probe. The opponent's decision to check already suggested weakness, and a turn card that improves your range relative to theirs compounds that advantage. Opponent tendencies matter here too. Against a player who checks frequently with marginal hands and then folds to pressure, the probe bet has strong fold equity. Against a player who checks specifically to trap with strong holdings, the probe becomes more dangerous and should be used selectively. Reading how often a specific opponent's checkback range is genuinely weak versus deceptively strong is what separates a well-timed probe from a costly mistake. Sizing affects both the information you gather and the pressure you create. A smaller probe bet of roughly a third to half the pot invites a response without committing too many chips. It's a lower-cost way to test the opponent's range. A larger probe bet applies more pressure and may generate more folds. But it also commits more of your stack. It gives the opponent a cleaner decision if they do have something strong. The size you choose should reflect what you're trying to accomplish. If you want information cheaply, size down. If the board strongly favors your range and their limited range looks particularly weak, sizing up extracts more value from their likely folds. Timing is connected to the checkback itself. Because the opponent skipped a continuation bet, the hand is being read differently than one where they bet the flop. That skipped bet is the reason the probe exists as a concept. It changes how your bet will be interpreted. When you lead into a player who checked, you're not just betting. You're responding to information. The opponent knows you know they checked. That context shapes how credible your probe looks and how difficult it makes their decision. When the opponent calls a probe bet, the question becomes what they're representing. A call without a raise on a street where they already checked often suggests a hand with showdown value but limited strength. That might be marginal top pair, second pair, or a weak draw. That read should inform how you proceed on the final street. If the river card is neutral and their range still looks capped, a second bet can apply continued pressure. If the river card improves the kinds of hands they'd call a probe with, slowing down tends to be the better choice. The probe bet is most reliable when the opponent's range is genuinely weak and the board texture supports your range. When those conditions aren't present, the play loses its structural foundation and becomes harder to justify. Chapter 21. Leveraging the squeeze play. The opener has a raising range. The callers have calling ranges. Both of those ranges carry a lot of hands that can't continue against serious pressure. That structural gap is what you're targeting. Its primary objective is to win the pot immediately. You're not trying to see a flop. You're applying enough pressure that the original raiser and every caller behind them face a decision they'd rather avoid. The raiser has to worry about folding equity working against them for once. The callers are in an even worse spot. They called preflop, which means they don't have a raising hand. Now they're facing a large re-raise with a hand they weren't willing to 3-bet themselves. In most spots, they fold. That's the asymmetry that makes the squeeze work.
Callers are in a structurally weak position.
They've already committed chips, but their range is capped by the fact that they didn't raise.
A player with a genuinely strong hand typically re-raises pre-flop rather than calling.
So the field of callers tends to be filled with speculative hands, suited connectors, small pairs, and Broadway combinations that don't want to play a large pot out of position against a 3-bet. The size of your squeeze is crucial. It needs to be large enough to make continuing unprofitable for those marginal holdings. A small re-raise doesn't create the necessary pressure. You want a size that puts real stress on the pot odds dynamic. The more callers there are between you and the original raiser, the larger the sizing typically needs to be. Each additional caller has inflated the pot and holds a range weak enough to fold. Now timing. Recognizing favorable conditions for a squeeze is key. Consider the original raiser's tendencies. A player who opens wide from late position is raising a lot of hands that can't continue against a re-raise. They open to steal or to see a flop cheaply, not to play a big pot. Against a tight opener who raises infrequently, the squeeze is less attractive. Their range is stronger on average, and they're more likely to 4-bet or call with hands that have genuine equity. Equally important are the tendencies of the callers. Wide callers who enter pots with a broad range of speculative hands are exactly the players you want between you and the raiser. They've already demonstrated they're not 3-betting, which confirms their range is capped. Their presence in the pot increases the squeeze's effectiveness. They add dead money and create fold pressure without adding genuine threat. Position influences the dynamics of the squeeze.
Squeezing from the button, or cutoff, is comfortable because you have informational advantages post-flop if you do get called.
But squeezes from the blinds are also common and can be highly effective. When you squeeze from the small blind or big blind, you're creating a pot odds problem for everyone who has already called. They have to call a large re-raise knowing they'll be out of position for the rest of the hand. That combination of range weakness and positional disadvantage narrows their continuing range considerably. Your table image can significantly impact the success of a squeeze. A tight image makes the squeeze more credible. If you've been playing few hands and showing down strong holdings, opponents are more likely to assign your re-raise a strong range and give you credit. A loose image works against you here because players are more willing to call or 4-bet when they don't believe you have the goods. The right targets share a few observable patterns. Loose raisers who open frequently from late position are prime candidates. Wide callers who enter pots without 3-betting confirm the structural weakness you need. Tight passive players who are protective of their stack and reluctant to commit chips without a premium hand tend to fold to squeeze pressure at a high rate.
Players with tight opening ranges are less favorable targets because their range is stronger and they're more likely to continue.
Consider the number of players left to act behind you.
Fewer opponents remaining means fewer chances for someone to wake up with a strong hand and 4-bet you. Fewer players left means a cleaner spot overall.
Balance keeps the play viable over time. If you only squeeze with premium hands, you become predictable, and opponents can fold without much cost. If you squeeze too frequently with weak holdings, observant players will adjust by 4-betting you or calling wider.
The squeeze works best when opponents can't determine whether you hold a strong hand or a well-timed bluff.
That uncertainty is what keeps the play viable, and it only exists when your range includes both.
Chapter 22: Advanced Stack Size Adjustments.
Every decision you make at the table sits inside a constraint you might not always be thinking about consciously.
The chips in front of you don't just represent money.
They define what moves are available to you and which ones aren't. In cash games, the general framework breaks into 3 tiers, and the strategic logic shifts meaningfully between them. These aren't rigid lines, but they're useful reference points for understanding how the decisions available to you change as your stack grows or shrinks. The clearest way to see why is through implied odds.
When there's more money behind, hitting a disguised strong hand can win a much larger pot.
A set, a flush, a hidden 2-pair all gain value when your opponent has chips to lose. That's the core of why deep stacks favor speculative hands and complex post-flop play. But implied odds don't exist in isolation. They depend on your opponent actually putting chips in when you hit. A tight, disciplined opponent who folds to pressure doesn't give you the same implied odds as a loose player who can't release a hand. Reverse implied odds work in the opposite direction. Deep stacks amplify this risk too. If you call a raise with a suited connector and flop top pair with a weak kicker, you might feel good about the hand. But if your opponent holds a higher pair or a better 2-pair combination, the deeper the stacks, the more you stand to lose on later streets. Reverse implied odds are why hand selection and board reading become more critical as stacks get deeper, not less. Short stacks operate on a completely different logic. With 20 big blinds or fewer, the post-flop game shrinks considerably. There's rarely enough money behind to make speculative calls worthwhile, and the stack-to-pot ratio tends to compress quickly once any meaningful bet goes in. Short stacks prioritize immediate equity. The question becomes whether your hand is strong enough to commit to right now, not whether it might develop into something strong later. At around 15 to 20 big blinds specifically, the re-steal stack depth makes a 3-bet shove over a late position open the most efficient use of fold equity. The math of the stack relative to the pot makes going all in the cleanest line at that depth. It's not a coincidence that this depth produces that specific play. The math of the stack relative to the pot makes all in the most efficient use of fold equity at that depth. Risk management looks different depending on where you sit in that stack spectrum. The core principle is consistent. As the pot grows relative to your remaining stack, a larger share of your chips is at risk. That's not just a mathematical observation. It's a practical constraint on how you should think about pot growth. With a large stack, protecting it from unnecessary variance is a real consideration. That doesn't mean playing passively. It means being selective about which pots you build and with what hands. Sizing bets to control pot growth is one of the main tools. A larger bet forces your opponent to risk more to continue, which reduces their pot odds and makes marginal calls less profitable for them. A smaller bet does the opposite. It keeps the pot manageable, but invites more opponents to stay in. Neither sizing is universally correct. The right choice depends on what you're trying to accomplish and how strong your hand actually is relative to the board and your opponent's likely range. Out of position with a marginal holding, smaller bets and more frequent checks tend to reduce the size of the pot you'll eventually have to navigate. That's not weakness. It's matching your pot-building aggression to your actual hand strength. With a short stack, risk management takes a different shape. The goal shifts toward preserving fold equity for spots where you can commit your remaining chips with genuine equity or genuine pressure. Leaking chips into marginal spots pre-flop or on early streets erodes the leverage you have. A short stack that's been chipped down further becomes harder to move opponents off hands because the all-in threat is smaller. The dynamic nature of stack sizes is where a lot of players lose ground. Stacks change throughout a session. A player who started deep
might be sitting at medium depth after losing a pot.
A short stack who doubled up is now in medium territory. The strategic framework that was correct an hour ago may no longer apply. Recognizing these transitions is crucial. As your stack shifts from deep into medium range, the implied odds case for speculative hands weakens.
You still have post-flop playability, but the potential upside on disguised hands is smaller.
Pre-flop opening ranges should reflect that. Hands that played well at deep stack depths because of their ability to flop hidden monsters become less attractive when there's less money to win.
Transitioning from medium to short stack territory, the strategy evolves. 3 betting shifts toward all-in pressure pre-flop.
Post-flop playability at short depths is limited enough that committing before the flop is often the cleaner line. The nuance here is that position and opponent tendencies still matter. Shoving over a tight player's open from out of position with a marginal hand is a different situation than applying pressure against a wide late position opener from the button. Opponent stack sizes require equal consideration. An opponent playing a short stack is generally more committed to any pot they enter. They're less likely to fold to post-flop pressure once they've put in a meaningful portion of their stack pre-flop. An opponent with a deep stack has more flexibility and more to lose, which affects how they respond to aggression. Adjusting your own approach to account for their depth, not just yours, is part of playing these spots well. The stack you hold right now defines the range of decisions available to you. The further you drift from recognizing that constraint, the more your strategy drifts from what the situation actually calls for.